Hi everyone, I'm Stan Mallow. Welcome to Paranormal Yakker. My guest today is renowned UFO researcher, lecturer, author, and filmmaker Robert Hastings. I'll be talking with him about his book, UFOs and Nukes, Extraordinary Encounters at Nuclear Weapon Sites. Robert Hastings, welcome to Paranormal Yakker.
Thank you very much.
You, Robert, have meticulously researched declassified U.S. government documents which confirm numerous UFO incursions at nuclear weapon sites, and also interviewed U.S. Air Force veterans who were involved in one or more of those incidents. What initially sparked your interest in wanting to explore the UFO-nuclear connection?
My father was career Air Force, and in 1967, our family was at a place called Malmstrom Air Force Base, Montana, which was then and still is a Minuteman nuclear missile base. Long story short, he worked in a building that had military radar, actually NORAD radar, which is a joint Canadian-American organization. And he heard rumors about unidentified flying objects, what persons on site were describing as saucer-shaped objects, maneuvering around the nuclear missile sites, some of the sites. Independently, I was a junior in high school. I was 16 going on 17, and I had a job 3 nights a week after high school in the base air traffic control tower. And one night in March, mid to late March, as best as I can determine, one of the FAA controllers, who was an acquaintance of mine, just casually almost, it seems, motioned me over to his scope as I walked by and pointed out 5 what are called targets, unidentified aerial objects that were on his scope. I had the impression that he was talking about UFOs, but he probably called them unknowns. Anyway, that sparked my interest, and I compared notes with my father, and he had in turn had heard about these rumors at the place he worked. So that really sparked my interest. And about 1973, I ran across an article in something called Saturday Evening Post magazine, written by Project Blue Book scientist Dr. J. Allen Hynek. And in December of 66, much to my surprise, he actually talked about very similar incidents at another base in North Dakota called Minot, where disc-shaped craft were maneuvering around nuclear missile sites. By late 73, I just took it upon myself. I was very curious. I also thought this was something that the public should be aware of. And I made it my life's work, as it turns out, to approach and interview retired Air Force personnel to see what they might know about these particular incidents.
UFO incursions at nuclear weapon sites occurred as early as 1945, even before the end of World War II, months prior to the atomic bombing in Japan. Can you, Robert, tell me about those incursions?
That was prior to the advent of nuclear missiles, but who I did interview was a retired Navy pilot named Bud Clem, who in early January 1945, some 9 months to the prior to the end of World War II, he was stationed, his squadron was stationed at a place called Hanford site in Washington State, which was the world's first plutonium production facility, a nuclear materials facility. And the base he was at was called NAS, Naval Air Station Pasco. And he described to me on multiple occasions in January of 1945 luminous objects, fully illuminated balls of light that would come in and hover over the Hanford site. And he and his squadron mates were sent up in what were then prop aircraft, what were called Hellcat, F-6F, I believe they were Hellcat fighters, to attempt to intercept these unknown balls of light. They were tracked on radar and so on. And in every case, according to this retired Navy pilot, these objects just walked away from the fighters like they were standing still. And there are actually documents that a researcher named Jan Aldrich has secured via the Freedom of Information Act that confirm that the radar, what was called the fourth U.S. Army, did track these objects on radar on 3 separate occasions in January of 45. So whoever are flying these things, they were aware of our nuclear program months, if not earlier, at least months prior to the bombings in Japan and the test in New Mexico, of course, the Trinity test, which kicked off the nuclear age.
While researching your book, Robert, did any government agencies try to dissuade you from writing it or intimidate and threaten those who agreed to be interviewed by you?
I began working on the book in 1998, but I went out on the college lecture circuit in 1981 because I did feel this was an important topic that the American public should be made aware of. And in the course of the first few lectures I gave around the country, mainly in the upper Midwest in the US, I had members, former or retired members of the Air Force in my audiences from time to time. They would approach me after the lecture and say, I know what you're talking about. I was involved in such and such. So I made arrangements with the ones who were willing to talk with me, the ones that were willing to give me a full interview. Not all of them were. The ones that were willing to talk with me months later in February of 1982, I began calling these gentlemen from my home in Illinois. And with their permission, I recorded the conversations. Well, after each phone call, and I'd hang up, within a minute or so, I would get another call from someone who wasn't saying anything, just breathing heavily into the phone and then hanging up. That occurred after each one of these conversations with the military veterans. It occurred at no other time. What was clear to me at that point was by me being out on the lecture circuit, I had gotten some national publicity, and suddenly I was on someone's radar, so to speak. And someone was probably intent on trying to intimidate me into backing off and not doing what I was doing. So that was the year, and that was long, long before the book came out.
Could you, Robert, tell me about a harrowing incident that took place at a missile base in Wyoming that involved the personnel there not being able to communicate with several of its missile launch control capsules, just as a large cigar-shaped craft slowly flew over them?
That's probably one of the most dramatic cases that I've investigated. Just prior to that, less than a month prior to that, in September 27th, actually, of 2010, I held a press conference in Washington with 7 Air Force veterans who were describing the kinds of incidents that we've been talking about. Less than a month later, suddenly on the Atlantic website, there was a national story that FE Warren Air Force Base in Wyoming, for what they claimed was less than an hour, could not communicate with 5 of their what are called missile alert facilities, each of which contains 2 launch control officers in an underground capsule. Each capsule controls 10 nuclear missiles. According to the Atlantic story, on October 23rd of 2010, suddenly the base could not get in touch with these 5 missile alert facilities. The implication being that if the President of the United States had ordered a launch of a nuclear attack on some country, those missile officers could not have received communications relating to that issue, that emergency. I suspected, although it was not stated in the Atlantic article, that there was probably a UFO involvement. And sure enough, when I checked with one of my longtime sources, a man named John Mills, who was retired Air Force, he was a missile targeting technician. He had contacts at FE Warren Air Force Base, and upon my request, he made contact with them. And sure enough, 2 of these missile maintenance technicians said that they were directly involved with going out into the field to attempt to ascertain the cause of this communications issue. And they told John Mills, who in turn told me, that while they were out in the field addressing the issue, they saw this huge cigar-shaped object flying through the air. And apparently, according to these 2 individuals, other teams reported seeing the object as well. Further, according to these individuals, at least one of the individuals, when the maintenance teams returned to FE Warren Air Force Base, their squadron commander told them as a group that they were not to discuss with anything, quote, that they may or may not have seen, end quote, while they were out in the field. So something quite dramatic went on. It did involve the report of this huge cigar-shaped object. I'm quite sure there was a link between that, the presence of that object, and the technical issues they were having.
Documents smuggled out of Russia in the 1990s confirm that Soviet nukes were also the focus of UFO interest during the Cold War era. One of those could very well have resulted in World War III. What, Robert, can you tell me about that incident?
A journalist named George Knapp, many of your viewers probably have heard of George Knapp. In, I think it was 93, but perhaps 1994, he went to Russia and tried to interview, actually successfully interviewed several dozen former Soviet Army officers regarding the UFO topic. One of the individuals, gentleman whose name I forget, I'm 75 now and I'm having memory issues, so hopefully your viewers will bear with me if I forget a name every now and then. This retired Soviet Army colonel told George Knapp that he had documents that indicated that in October of 1982, in then Soviet Ukraine, a huge disc-shaped object hovered over a nuclear missile base. And down in one of the launch capsules, according to the document that this colonel gave to George Knapp, who subsequently smuggled it out of Russia, believe it or not, one of these documents described this incident in Soviet Ukraine in October of 82, where when this disc hovered above the missile base, suddenly some number of missiles, unspecified is my understanding in the document, suddenly went into countdown mode. They were preparing to launch. And indeed, if they had gone to actual launch mode and become airborne and headed toward either Western Europe or, North America, that could have been World War III. According to this Soviet document that George brought back to the US, after 15 seconds, however, the malfunction ceased, everything returned to normal, and so a crisis was averted. Now, I've been in touch with a Russian journalist. It's been a number of years. I don't remember her name, but she wrote an article. It's in my book. She wrote an article describing interviews that her magazine had done with some of these military personnel who were there that day. And they confirmed that indeed that did take place. Apparently, troops at ground level had fired a missile at this object, an anti-aircraft missile at this object, and that perhaps precipitated the response where these missiles suddenly were put into launch mode. That's speculative at this point, but quite amazing. I indeed, as I describe in my book, I've interviewed a man named David Shore, who was a missile launch officer at Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota. And in 66 or 67, he couldn't remember which, he experienced a very similar incident where suddenly some of his missiles went into countdown mode and he had to flip what's called an inhibit switch to prevent them from launching. And he is one of the prime interviews in my book describing that kind of event.
The reported recovery of a crashed alien spaceship in Roswell, New Mexico in 1947 is well known. What is not as well known is that at the same time, Roswell Army Airfield was home to the world's only atomic bomber squadron. That puts a whole new spin on the Roswell incident. What has your research shown?
I don't really know much more about it than what you've just described, but that indeed is correct. During the period in July of 1947, when this object was allegedly recovered, and I do believe it was recovered, a non-human, an NHI, non-human intelligence vehicle, that was Roswell Army Airfield, was the world's only nuclear bomber base. I think it's not coincidental. I think indeed there was a link.
I agree with you. While there has been much speculation about it, do we, Robert, know the reason or reasons why alien beings have shown the interest they have in our nuclear sites?
If someone knows, they'd be in the Pentagon or the CIA, and they're not talking to me. But what I've told my lecture audiences for many years and what I've written in the book is that one reasonable hypothesis would be that somehow, for some reason, they have an interest in humankind and or the welfare of the planet. And they understand that if indeed we do go launch a major nuclear war, not only would it drastically impact human civilization, it would pollute the planet with radioactivity that would last for thousands of years, unfortunately. And so perhaps for altruistic reasons, they've engaged in these heavy hints by flying over our nuclear missiles and the Russians' nuclear missiles, and from time to time disrupting their functionality, perhaps to send a message, a heavy hint, so to speak. I've also said, however, that if indeed they have bases here, if they have operations ongoing on the planet. There have been many reports recently of objects emerging from under the ocean and flying away. So it's conceivable under the vast stretches of the unexplored ocean, there are alien bases. And if that's the case, or if they have other operations on the planet at ground level, if we engage in a nuclear war, it would drastically impact their own presence here, let alone what it would do to humankind. So they may have selfish reasons as well in that sense.
You, Robert, are an experiencer and, in fact, have had multiple abduction experiences. However, that is something you did not reveal until fairly recently. Why is that?
I began interviewing military witnesses in 1973. By 1981, as I said, I felt strongly enough that the public needed to be in on the secret, so I went public with these nuclear weapons related cases. That was my whole reference point on the phenomenon up until 1988. On August 13th of 1988, however, I went on a camping trip with about 15 people in a remote area near Albuquerque, New Mexico in the mountains. And what happened that night made clear to me beyond any doubt that I and two other people were involved in a quote abduction experience. If you can imagine, I was stunned. I was aware of abduction reports, but I never ever thought it would enter my own life. I had no clue that this was something I would have to deal with personally, but there it was. I procrastinated for 4 years, but ultimately, even though I had some sketchy memories of what occurred that night, 4 years later, I employed the services of a clinical psychologist named Dr. Sandy Sylvester, and she engaged in time regression hypnosis with me, which is a controversial subject, but to my satisfaction, over the course of 6 weeks, I had 6 one-hour sessions. And what emerged from those sessions further reinforced my conscious memories of engaging with these non-human entities, specifically the type of beings that we commonly call grays. And so, even though that was all going on in my life, I realized that abductions, the topic of abductions, is so controversial. It's just a bridge too far for many, many people. I knew quite clearly that if I were to suddenly publicly acknowledge everything I've just told you back in the late 80s, I would lose a great deal of credibility with the media. I was getting lots of media interviews when I gave my lectures. I suspected those would dwindle to nearly nothing if suddenly I'm talking on the podium about being an abductee. So I just kept my mouth shut. I kept this secret. But in 2017, I was diagnosed with a serious heart condition. It was made clear to me that my future was uncertain. And so I just decided that I didn't want to leave the planet without revealing this part of my situation. It's part of the overall picture. So I teamed up with one of the veterans I had interviewed, a man named Dr. Bob Jacobs, who was involved in something called the Big Sur UFO incident, Big Sur SUR UFO incident. If people Google it, they'll find out about that. Turns out he confessed to me that he was having abduction experiences too. And like me, he felt if we're going to be honest with the public, trying to get this military information out to them about UFOs, we should also be honest with everyone and just say, look, that's not the full picture, people, and talk about our own experiences. So we wrote a second book. I co-authored this book with him. It was my second book called Confession, in which he and I describe as best as possible the kinds of experiences that we've had. But that was my rationale for keeping quiet about that until more recently.
Could you, Robert, share perhaps one of your abduction experiences?
As I said, they started in August of 88. One of the most dramatic was in early 95. I didn't record the date, but it was the winter months of early 1995. I was in a hotel room in Pittsburgh. I had given a lecture the night before, and I was preparing to fly back home the next day. Sometime before midnight, I think, but I didn't have a chance to look at the bedside clock. I suddenly awoke and I had what can only be described as a telepathic message. If anyone has not had that, which is most humans, it's very hard to describe, but what I heard in my head quite clearly and distinctly, it was not my imagination. I heard, "We are here for you. You've met us before." And I knew I had already had a number of experiences. I knew something was about to happen, and I blurted out loud, "They're here." And no sooner had I said that, yelled it almost, I lifted off the bed. I was levitating. I was heading toward the ceiling. Now, I had read in the literature, the abduction literature, about people levitating when the entities enter their bedroom and so on. So there I was. It's shocking beyond belief. Nothing in a human's life can prepare you for that kind of experience. It's not a part of our paradigm. People don't fly. Well, suddenly I was hovering in the air. I can laugh about it now because it happened many, many years ago, and it's old hat to me. I'm just used to its reality. It doesn't shock me anymore. But I was clearly heading toward the ceiling. Now, if one again looks at the UFO abduction literature, one will find reference after reference to people being taken by these aliens, these entities, through solid objects like a closed window or a wall. Somehow, it's probably a quantum phenomenon, quantum physics phenomenon, but people are describing being taken actually through physical objects. I was heading toward the ceiling. I then blacked out, but I have to presume that I was taken through the ceiling of the hotel room somehow. I don't know how it's done, obviously. But what seemed like the next instant, one minute I'm looking at the ceiling approaching rapidly, and the next instant, it was obviously hours later. The room was filled with bright sunlight, and I was laying back on the bed, just trying to grapple, just going, oh my God, did that really happen? And I eventually got up off the bed and went into the bathroom and turned on the light switch. Well, there was no electricity. There had been a power failure in the hotel overnight. If your listeners or your viewers rather are familiar with many UFO incidents over the years, power failures are often a feature of those encounters. So I was very suspicious of the lights not working, and I suspected it had something to do with what I recalled having occurred to me. Eventually, I went outside to get some lunch. I was getting hungry. There was a fire engine in the parking lot with a fireman leaning against it, smoking a cigarette. And I walked up to him and I said, is there a fire in the hotel? I didn't hear an alarm. And he was real puzzled. He was waving his cigarette around while he was talking to me. He said, no, real puzzled. No, he said, those two hotels had a power failure overnight. And then he turned and said, all those restaurants on the other side of the street are on the same grid and they're just fine. So we're trying to figure out why this power failure only affected these two hotels. Well, I was pretty sure I knew why the power was off, but I wasn't going to say anything to him. I was just rolling my eyes at that point, basically. So I would say that was probably one of the most memorable encounters that I've had. Nothing has happened to me that I can recall like that since December of 2014. So for whatever reason, they're done with me. I think they don't interact with me anymore. Bob Jacobs, on the other hand, continues to have a handful of encounters even in the past 12 months.
Since you, Robert, have amassed a vast network of contacts within the UFO UAP world, I was wondering if you would venture to guess when we will have full disclosure and governments will finally tell their citizens the truth about what they know regarding UFOs, UAPs, and alien beings visiting our planet.
Unfortunately, it's not going to be anytime soon. It inevitably has to happen because I am getting on in age. I hope to live to see it, but I'm not sure that's going to happen either. Ultimately, the President of the United States, in conjunction with world leaders, is going to have to get on television all over the planet and talk about the reality of this. That'll be the big breakthrough, in my view. I don't expect it anytime soon. What I am encouraged about is in the United States, in the last 2 years in particular, there have been some dramatic developments in terms of people like Lou Elizondo, who your viewers, I'm sure, know that name, and David Grush, who talked about while he was with the UAP task force, learned unequivocally that we have secret programs involved with reverse engineering crashed UFOs. And he said we also have what he called biologics, that is, alien bodies in our possession. I never expected in my lifetime to see congressional testimony to that effect. So that's encouraging. Lou Elizondo, I think it was last November of 24, actually mentioned the nuclear weapons connection very briefly. So little by little, some very important things are coming out. As far as the major, unequivocal, irrefutable breakthrough, who knows when that's going to happen.
Should viewers of Paranormal Yakker want to buy UFOs and Nukes extraordinary encounters at nuclear weapon sites. How, Robert, can they do that?
It's available at Amazon. I thank you for mentioning that. It's not as if I'm trying to sell books. And so I will say that at my website, which is UFOHastings.com, I have probably 20 or 30 articles that are excerpts in essence from the book. If someone's interested in the nuclear weapons connection with UFOs, but doesn't want to buy the book, just go to my website and you will find article after article describing the things that I mentioned in the book.
Robert Hastings, I thank you for being my guest on Paranormal Yakker. Yakking with you about the UFO nuclear connection has been an extremely fascinating and informative experience. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Hi, everyone. This is Stan Mallow, the Paranormal Yakker. I hope you enjoyed the interview you just watched. So that you don't miss any upcoming shows, be sure to subscribe to my free YouTube channel. To do that, just press the subscribe button on your screen.